Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are looking at a period in history that literally rewrote the landscape of a nation. We're exploring how America, in a remarkably short span between 1870 and the First World War, rapidly transformed from a quiet farming-based society into a bustling, towering urban empire. It's a story of just absolutely incredible scale and ambition, and I am so excited to walk you through it. Okay, let's dive into this with a number that sets the scale perfectly. 1.2 million. That is the massive number of immigrants who arrived in America in the year 1914 alone. Just wrap your head around that sheer volume of human movement in a single year. All these new arrivals came seeking opportunity, and in doing so, they fueled an absolutely insatiable demand for workers across a rapidly changing country. Which brings us to the central mystery that we are going to unpack today. How exactly did America transform so relentlessly in just 50 short years? How did the United States manage to build massive, towering skylines and establish a completely new modern culture, all while battling the incredible growing pains that come with adding millions of new people to its shores? Section 1. The pace of urbanization. Now, it's kind of wild to think about, but until 1920, the majority of Americans actually still lived and worked on the land, not in cities. But against that backdrop, the speed of city growth was absolutely unprecedented. Let's make sure we clearly define what we mean by urbanization, because it's our foundational concept here. Urbanization is simply the process of making an area more urban. But in this specific era, it wasn't just about expanding borders. It was characterized by an ever-changing vista of new, taller commercial and civic buildings competing for space. Imagine arriving in a big city like Chicago for the first time. You would be totally awestruck. You'd be met with deafening noise, constant movement, massive new housing blocks, tramways, and imposing elevated railways. It was just a bewildering variety of economic activity happening all around you at once. And this rapid city growth was paired with a massive natural population surge. Notice the leap here. In 1900, the U.S. population sat at roughly 76 million, but by 1920, it had exploded to 100 million. What's really interesting is the mechanics behind that growth. The birth rate in the United States was actually declining during this time, but the death rate had plummeted. At just 16.5 deaths per thousand people, it was literally the lowest death rate in the entire world. People were simply living longer, which compounded those massive population spikes. Section 2. Engines of city growth. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what was driving this rapid expansion. You see, the American frontier, those vast tracts of free or cheap Western land, was essentially closed by this point. So new immigrants lacked the capital needed to buy increasingly expensive farmland. They had to turn to wages. This led directly to the rise of industrialization and what we call secondary industry, which is the large-scale introduction of manufacturing. Immigrants just flooded into the cities to work in construction, booming service industries, and the garment sweatshops. But this growth wasn't spread evenly across the map. It concentrated heavily in the north and the east. Immigrants often settled exactly where they landed, like right near Ellis Island and the Jersey Shore, or they funneled along direct railroad routes straight into New York's Grand Central. Ultimately, a massive industrialized corridor formed, stretching from the East Coast all the way over to Chicago. And a really fascinating detail here is that new arrivals frequently clustered in the exact same geographic areas and trades as their countrymen who had met them right off the boat. This timeline adds another absolutely crucial layer to our understanding. City growth wasn't just driven by transatlantic immigration. It was heavily fueled by internal migration from the countryside and the South. Around 1910, African Americans began a major northward migration to cities like Chicago in search of industrial opportunity. We already noted that peak of 1.2 million transatlantic immigrants in 1914, but as the First World War broke out, that northward internal migration increased dramatically in scale to keep those northern industrial hubs running. Section 3. Small towns and big culture. It's super easy to think of this unrelenting growth as just a big city phenomenon, right? But it changed the cultural fabric everywhere. Take Belleville, Illinois. This was a smaller town with a population of maybe 5 to 30,000. Yet urbanization transformed it completely, bringing modern street lighting, trams, and public utilities. Then on the flip side, look inside the massive big cities. You had districts like Over the Rhine in Cincinnati. Because immigrants clustered together, districts like this functioned as entirely separate, self-contained German-American small towns, right in the middle of a massive metropolis. This dense concentration of people also massively accelerated modern mass entertainment and advertising. A perfect example of this is the Nickelodeon. named because admission literally cost a single nickel. These were early, small cinemas that catered to the everyday masses, and they really marked the emergence of the modern film industry. Alongside these, you had large theaters and music halls springing up, designed to entertain everyone from the wealthy elite down to the everyday factory worker. But we have to look at the full, unvarnished picture here. The American city during this time was a place of extreme contrast. On one hand, you had absolute marvels, awe-inspiring skylines, elevated railways, the explosion of mass entertainment. But right alongside that were the grim realities: brutal garment sweatshops, deeply crowded tenements, and severe concentrated poverty. And as the historical sources note, it was actually these grim conditions prevailing in many major cities that began to spark political opposition to further immigration by 1920. Section 4. The Rise of Slums. So the crucial point is, when you have this unrelenting pace of human concentration, profound complications are totally inevitable. By the year 1910, an astounding 50 different cities in the United States boasted populations of more than 100,000 inhabitants. And this rapid, overwhelming influx led directly to the creation of slums. We define slums as heavily populated urban areas characterized by substandard housing and squalor. Because new arrivals desperately needed wages and couldn't buy land, they just packed into the cheapest, most densely populated secondary industry neighborhoods available. The sheer volume of settlement created these deeply impoverished areas, notably emerging in places like Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan and the big industrial centers of Pittsburgh. Now, this wasn't some hidden secret at the time. The problem was very well documented. The most famous example is Jacob Riis's groundbreaking 1890 work, How the Other Half Lives. Using newly invented flash photography, he captured this severe squalor which completely shocked the public and slowly led to some early concerted civic efforts to clear out these tenements and improve baseline living conditions. These early efforts to fix the cities were largely championed by what we call progressive governments. These were reform-minded, increasingly professionalized city and state administrations that actively tried to intervene and improve society. When they looked at this explosive urban growth, their main priorities were providing essential infrastructure, specifically building out schools for the children of immigrants and paving roads to handle the massive new populations. However, looking at the historical record, we see the very clear limits of their intervention. It played out in a tough sequence. Step 1. The population influx was simply unrelenting. Step 2. These progressive governments would build out schools and roads as fast as their budgets allowed. But Step 3 was the inevitable reality. The sheer mathematical growth of the slums consistently outpaced their civic capacity. The massive scale of the problem was ultimately beyond the ability of even a dedicated, professionalized government to fully manage. Which leaves us with a really provocative, echoing question to consider as we wrap up this explainer. If the best, most professional, reform-minded governments of the 1920s simply couldn't outpace the math of unrelenting urban growth, what does that mean for the limits of managing our own massive, rapidly expanding cities today? Human migration and urban concentration are forces of incredible power, and understanding how they built the modern world is the very first step in understanding how to navigate our future. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time.